Right. Okay. I'm going to talk. What I'm going to talk about is the Yemeni aspects of this problem to show the rise of the Houthis, their current importance, and also why they should not be underestimated or indeed overestimated. The Houthis originated from this area in the North Sada, the Sada region, which in Yemeni terms is an area where the major tribal confederations that influence politics under the imams was weakest. They are descendants of the Prophet Sada, Sayyid, Hashemites in Yemeni terms, who have a special status in society. They provided the imams, and they're religious scholars and intermediaries in disputes. The imamate of Yemen, has been in Yemen, started in the 10th, 11th centuries, expanded in the 16th century to cover the whole of Yemen. But was pushed back as tribes in the southern part of Yemen revolted against it in the 18th century. And this led so that by the beginning of the 20th century, there was in effect two regimes in Yemen. I just want to go back, sorry, one slide. This map shows the borders between what's the PDRY, which is the Marxist regime set up in 1967 on land which the imamate had not run since the 19th century. Then the imamate of Yemen here. The imamate was overthrown in a 1962 revolution, which led to 8 years of civil war. Which ended essentially in a compromise, which saw the Yemen Arab Republic. The Yemen Arab Republic in its later years was dominated by Ali Abdullah Saleh and his regime, whose policy is often described as he described himself, dancing of the heads of snakes. But essentially, what was mean is to balance the various factions that emerged in Yemen, so that Saleh always remained on top. And in the initial years, the main threat to his position came from Marxism of the PDRY, and in response to that, he encouraged what was already happening, which is the spread of Salafism, Wahhabism, from coming down from Saudi Arabia, and of the ideas of the Muslim Brotherhood, which had been brought into the country by Egyptian and other teachers. And he encouraged also the formation of a political party, Islah, which embodies these groups and in effect was working with him to balance the Yemeni Socialist Party and the Marxists. This was a process that was seen as a long-term process involving what people call the Sunnization of Zaydism, the intrusion of Salafism into Zaydi heartland and the Zaydi Shia heartland, and the marginalization of Sada, the Hashemites, the people like the Houthis. And because of the way that Saleh ran the system, he paid tribal leaders to really look after the tribes, but to assist him with power, and it led to a weakening between the tribal leaders and the tribes. This led to revivals amongst the Zaydi Shia Muslims, which would be in the majority in that part of Yemen. Inspired in part by the Iranian Revolution. The first emergence of the Houthis was in something called the Believing Youth in the 1990s. It was a religious and social movement. It was run, set up really by Hussein Badr al-Din al-Houthi, whose sermons and writings, called collectively the Malazim, are the guidance provided for the Houthi movement. The Houthis are a radical departure from traditional Zaydis Islam. They really want to go back to the basics of the Quran and provide their own guidance to how it should be interpreted. The power is in the hands of God. and he trusts this power to selected individuals, descendants from the Prophet, which also includes the Houthi family, but not many others. The part of this revival was an attempt to free the world of influences, which they some malign influences from Jews and America, so that the anti-Israeli feeling, anti-American feeling has been part of this, central to this from the beginning. It sums up in the Saqa, which is that piece on the right in Arabic, death to America, death to Israel, curse on Jews, victory to Islam. Ali Abdullah Saleh set out to try and marginalize and end the movement in the early 2000s, and in the early part of that, Hussein was killed, succeeded by his father, then his youngest brother Abdul Malik, who's photographed there, who is the current leader, who's ruthless, pragmatic, unemotional, charismatic, all effective at building networks and personal loyalty and control. This is a quote from him. There were 6 rounds of fighting between the Houthis and the army between 2004 and 2010. The main army units in wars linked to it, main military units were linked to Islah and supported by Islamic militias. And the Houthis were undefeated in this period and were able to exploit the scorched earth tactics used by the Rim to widen their support within Yemen. The Saleh regime fell in 2011. It coincided with the Arab Spring, but it had been cracking for some time. And there was an international process led by the GCC and the UN to actually prevent a civil war between those two parts of the regime, between Saleh and Islam. There were great hopes for the success of this system, but it was undermined by flaws within the agreement, chiefly allowing Saleh, who was ousted from the presidency but allowed to stay, he spent much of his time then in trying to weaken the internationally recognized government of President Abdul Rahman Mansour al-Hadi. And I was watching this very closely in the 2000s. I could see that the Houthis, who took part in some of the discussions about the future of the city, but future of the country, but they began to expand from their northern heartland in the Sada province, gradually moving into neighboring provinces. And then in 2014, there was a very rapid move down towards Sana'a to take the capital. And although the militias were clearly a key part of this, it was the networks of Sada Hashemites, descendants of the prophets, like the Houthis, who helped pave the way, and in the process they weakened the power of the main tribal leaders of the confederation opposing them. But it became clear as I was watching this that they were attacking military units linked to Islam, and that was the first clue of the Faustian pact that Saleh signed with the Houthis, and it was that enabled them to take over Sana'a in 2014. These Houthis then continued to put pressure on the Hadi. He was forced into signing a peace and national partnership agreement, which actually gave the Houthis power without responsibility. But they continued to put pressure on him, and I'm afraid a characteristic that's come out, was shown there, that has happened subsequently, that the Houthis don't see a compromise as something the other side should make and implement, and that they have a record of not implementing their own commitments. In January 2015, Hadi was resigned and put under house arrest. The Houthis took formal control of the state then, with Saleh in 2015, absorbing the existing state. President Hadi escaped away through his resignation. That led to the Saudi-led intervention and the start of the 9-year war in 2015. The Houthis killed Saleh in 2017 and have since ruled alone. In government, the Houthis really control about 2/3 of the population, 1/3 of the territory, but they have the capital and the main institutions of the state. Abdul Malik al-Houthi remains the key decision maker, but he really makes very few public appearances. He stays out of sight and has survived many years of war and many years of Saudi bombing. The Houthi family, some people describe the Houthi regime as almost a Houthi family enterprise, because the members of the family occupy many key positions within the system, and also as do the other Hashemite families. It's where power resides. It is governed through a supreme political council led by Mahdi al-Mashhad, who's a close associate of Abdul Malik al-Houthi, and which actually runs the government. The Houthis asserted control gradually through supervisors who were put into ministries and into local government, and to enable them to set up a network of control. And all that, in parallel with that, they also took over the existing intelligence and security services to assert control. They tax. They have, of course, the revenue from the government. They tax and extract money from a wide range of activities. But the bottom line is they can't fund the war and pay for governance. And this is one of their weaknesses. So, and it's state salaries, which tend to be unpaid or only partially paid. But it's an authoritarian and repressive regime. It's difficult to calculate how popular it is, but it doesn't appear to be accepted by a majority. But the effective and brutal oppression of any organized dissent. The relations with Iran, which I think Ed is going to talk about, was there from the outset. Early links to Al-Qaeda, but we'll come back to that later. And this is all against the background of a population facing the world's worst humanitarian crisis, with 20 million Yemenis currently needing some form of humanitarian relief. I'm just going to talk briefly about the opponents of the Houthis, because I think when you're looking at deterring them, one has to take them into account. The UAE and Saudis took similar, but actually quite different approaches. The UAE deployed its own armed forces, helped recruit, equip, and train, and mentor, and often accompany into battle southern militias that they developed, and they succeeded through these tactics in pushing the Houthis out of the south. They trained Yemenis in counter-terrorism units in Aden and Maqalla, favouring Salafis, who, like that, the UAE distrust Islah because of its link to the Muslim Brotherhood. The UAE arranged the appointment of Adi as governor of Aden in 2016 and supported him in creating the Southern Transition Council in 2017 after Hadi sacked him. That is the organisation that wants to restore the previous southern state. The UAE spearheaded a plan to seize Haditha ports in 2018, which would have dealt a major economic and strategic blow to the Houthis. And many Yemeni commentators lament that was stopped. But it was stopped under pressure from the international community and humanitarian aid organizations over the likely damages and casualties to a port that was mainly used for humanitarian relief. Following that, the UAE withdrew most of its forces but maintained a presence in the south, and it still supports the SDC, which took over Aden in 2019. The Saudi role is much more hands-off. And they ought to have started from a position of strength, because at the end of the civil war in the 1980s, they actually were the dominating influence in Yemen. The government of Ali Abdullah Saleh was depended to a considerable extent on Saudi financial support, and there was a special committee for Yemen, which actually paid a whole network of key figures in Yemen, tribal leaders, military people, merchants, etc., to should we say, to make sure that the Saleh's policy was roughly in what the Saudis wanted. But but after a board agreement with Yemen, between Saudi Arabia and Yemen in 2000, the focus switched to counter-terrorism, and saw this special committee weakened, and with it the Saudi ability to influence events. And it slipped down the order of priorities. I was visiting Riyadh in even in the early 2011s. Yemen seemed number 6 or 7 on the list of priorities by succession, what was going in Bahrain and Egypt and elsewhere. But the Houthis advances in 2014-15, and at the time of the accession of King Salman and the appointment of Mohammed bin Salman as defense minister, did change things and led, in fact, to the war, which was launched to restore President Houthis' international recognized government. And presented by the Saudis as a proxy war against Iran and as part of a regional struggle. Saudi trained and equipped the Yemenis to fight the war, backed some advisors, but it mainly depended on a bombing campaign and the naval blockade of the ports, but also providing economic support and humanitarian relief to the non-Houthi areas. But it was a much more hands-off approach than the UAE. The front lines have been stalemate since then, but the Saudis were long aware of the shortcomings of the Hadi regime, and they changed strategy in 2022, partly inspired by the Houthi missiles and drones, which have been directed towards Saudi cities and economic installations. And it's becoming a serious problem and potentially disrupting to the Mohammed bin Salman's economic ambitions. So the Australian strategy involved 3. There was a truce, which has started in April 2022 and has been maintained. And then direct negotiations with the Houthis in parallel with what was going on with the international community. And that led to the formation, and also led to the formation of a presidential council with more direct and active involvement in trying to manage Yemen. Now that council, the Presidential Leadership Council, has replaced the internationally recognized, it is the international government, replaced Hadi, but it's a Saudi UAE creation, but it gathers in the leaders of regional power and influence, often with military power behind them, within a single committee, led by Rashid al-Alimi, a former Minister of Interior, 7 vice presidents, each representing these different power centers. But it's one of these things which look good in practice, in theory, but it doesn't work in practice. The most powerful part of it is the Southern Transition Council, which is backed by the UAE still, led by Idris al-Zubaydi, and 2 of the other vice presidents, who the Southern links, have become part of the STC. It's in control in Aden and the area around, but the STC's claim to speak for the South is actually contested in parts of the South. But it's well organized and has a de facto military forces through its UAE trained militias, and it wants to restore an independent state. The other main part of it is SLAH, the regular army units backed by Saudi Arabia, support al-Alimi, but want a unified Yemen. The STC, like the UAE, is anti-Islam, and the power of that part of the of the PLC really partly resides in northern Hadramaut, where there are still Yemeni army units with northern soldiers, Mahra and in Marib, where the governor of Marib, which reports I'll come to in a minute, is part of the PLC. And the other element is Tariq Saleh, nephew of Ali Abdullah Saleh, leads the National Resistance Forces, actually control of Bab al-Mandeb, part of the Red Sea coast, and that was supposed to pierce the main force attacking Hodeidah in 2018. But all these different elements have different ambitions and different views of Yemen. So the PLC is unable to provide much governance. The Houthi threats have halted already reduced oil exports. Limited oil exports were stopped when Houthis threatened to attack the facilities and the tankers with an aim to, if the Houthis couldn't have that income, they would certainly deprive the PLC of it. And the PLC is also weakened by the different attitude, different policies between the Saudi Arabia and the UAE. So it's not a cohesive military threat to the Houthis or a convincing source of pressure against them, except locally and regionally. So it's unsurprising in these circumstances the Houthis seem confident. They think they can wait for the peace deal with the Saudis because they know that's what Riyadh wants, and they know the PLC is divided, and they are recruiting soldiers at the moment. This is to try and illustrate what I've just said. The green bit is the area controlled by the Houthis. This yellow bit is roughly the area controlled where the SDC has the greatest influence. Here is the area near the Bab al-Mandeb controlled by Tariq Saleh, and this is the area which is more, it's not one thing or the other. It's loyal to al-Alimi. A link to that is the oil and gas. These just to note that these are the chief. These are not. This is not. Oil and gas in Yemen is not particularly large internationally, but it's important in terms of the foreign currency for Yemen. And all these areas at the moment, the oil and gas is actually in the hands of the PLC, and much of it is actually in the hands of the what was in the hands of the what was the PDRY. The Saudi-Houthi deal, which was just been negotiated a few months ago. The Saudi Arabia wants, the main concession that Saudi Arabia wanted was to be seen as a mediator in the peace talks, not participant to the war between the Yemenis, and as an arbiter in trying to bring the two sides together. And its real purpose is he wants to end any threat from Yemen, whether Yemeni, Iranian, or Qaeda, to its political and economic ambitions. The deal appears to offer Houthis money to pay all the state salaries for a year, make a substantial contribution to the reconstruction, development, and governance. There's a series of confidence-building measures, some of which have been implemented, others have not. It removes the blockades of ports and allows airports to reopen fully. And it seemed close to signature on the 7th of October. It does appear to be remain in the interests of both parties. But from the PLC point of view, it leaves the PLC to negotiate the future of Yemen with the Houthis under a UN-led roadmap, where the unresolved major issues over access and share of the oil and gas and control and trust. It's something that does worry the PLC leaders. And they who also remember the Houthis have this reputation for reneging on previous agreements. So the Houthis really seem to think they've won the war and therefore can use the peace potentially to take control of all Yemen. But the Houthis have their weaknesses too. I mean, the Abdul Malik has limited exposure to the outside world, which I think affects his policies. There's a hubristic core to it, complete overconfidence. You can see it in the public statements made by the Houthis currently over what's going on in the Red Sea. Militarily, his effect is in stalemate. And it's worth noting that there's a 2-year campaign by the Houthis to try and take Marib with its key energy resources and its route to other ones. It failed. in part because it was an area where coalition air power could actually make a decisive difference. Much more exposed, flatter areas than the Yemeni mountains, where much of the fighting has been done. But the Houthi economy, I've said earlier, can't generate the resources needed to fight the war and pay officials. So it needs access to oil and gas. Opposition is growing to it, and the de facto blockade of ports sort of remains. It's not been. It has been limited easing. And the whole question of the devastation, displacement of people, hunger, and poverty. But the Houthis still can threaten Saudi cities if they decide to do so, and it can still prevent the PLC from exporting oil. The potential importance of peace deal with Saudis is that it will allow a greater flow of resources into them and leave them to negotiate with the divided opponents. And it's quite interesting that the Saudis have been quite reluctant to should we say, support the current operations in the Red Sea. And even the Houthi the other day praised the Saudis for doing so. Just finishing off, this is my last slide, the current situation. The Houthi attacks on shipping give them popularity, attention, and relevance. It fits with their core ideology. It gets them noticed, and it allows them to appeal to their own supporters, but also people wider in Yemen, whom the current conflict in Gaza has a strong resonance. The Houthis are well organized, determined, patient, and confident. They're currently reinforcing the front lines, suggesting that they may want to use military pressure to put military pressure on the PLC. And they don't really need a huge campaign in the Red Sea. And a few rockets every, something happening every few days seems to suit them, because it has the effect of deterring the shipping. The capacity is provided by Iran. It's part of the excess distance, which Ed is going to talk about. The Houthis brush off threats from the allies. That sanctions have little impact. The terrorist designation does not deter them. They say we're not quite sure it's going to be imposed yet, but it may well threaten the population, as the previous one might have done. They have this record of not implementing agreements, and they all seem to act in their own interests, not those of the population under their control. So I'm finishing with those three questions, but I don't necessarily know the answers. Will they stop? Will they stop attacks on shipping if conditions for Gaza are met? Possibly, but with Houthis, I really don't know. I think it will depend on events at the time. But there may be a chance. They may have felt they've overextended themselves. Will they continue to attack shipping linked to US and UK after the Gaza war, because they've said they would target them currently? And will they in the future disrupt the Red Sea shipping for other causes? Over to Ed.
Thanks, Noel. It's great exposition of the history. I'm mindful of the time, and I'm going to try to pare down a little bit my remarks. I think what would be of most interest will probably be some personal reflections from my time as ambassador to Yemen, and then to turn to the present situation in the Red Sea. So, having spent a lot of time negotiating with the Houthis at a time when I was solely focused on achieving peace in Yemen, I want to sort of sound the alarm, not that I think anyone listening will need it, but this is not a liberation movement. It is an extraordinarily virulent, chauvinistic and violent group, as Noel has said. I remember two moments of brutal clarity from senior Houthi leaders. One was when they told me, long before they actually did it, that they were only in an alliance of convenience with Ali Abdullah Saleh, but as soon as he ceased to be useful to them, they would kill him. The second was when they told me that they would inevitably win in Yemen in the end, and of course I queried that, given the coalition against them. And they said, but we will win because we care. Excuse me, we will win because you care. and we don't. You care about the deaths of Yemenis. We don't care how many people die. When enough have died, you will beg us to make peace. And then later, when I saw their snipers in Aden and Taz killing civilians for fun, doctors and nurses in a hospital ducking under window frames to go about their business because a gat-crazed Houthi sniper on a rooftop opposite was picking off anyone who showed themselves at the window. That was when my interlocutor's words came back to me as perhaps holding some truth. A few anecdotes from the period. This was November 2014 when I started reading in as ambassador, and then to January 2017, which was when I finished the assignment. I actually did the job from exile in Jeddah because we had to withdraw from Sana'a in early 2015, partly for security reasons and partly because the Houthis were forcing my predecessor into situations where they'd try and photograph her and make it look as if she was recognizing their legitimacy. So we couldn't work from Sana'a any longer, and both the British and the Americans and some others opened the mission in Jeddah. I travelled to Muscat very early on to facilitate contact between the Americans and the Houthis, who at that time were willing to talk to us, but not to the US. And the Omanis graciously hosted 2 sessions of talks between me and senior Houthi, which amounted to about 10 hours of intense debate and negotiation in Arabic. And that was when those rather chilling comments were made to me. I succeeded in the limited scope of my mission, and of course US Houthi contact was indeed established at that time. And later I played a prominent support role in 3 sessions of peace talks between the Houthis and representatives of President Hadi and the international community as well. I also reached out extensively to Saleh loyalists and associates to try to work on that side of the Yemeni puzzle. And I got to know him very much like many of the Congress Party figures, like the current leader of the governing council, Rashad al-Alimi, whom Noel mentioned. Working closely with the really very high quality and very committed UN envoys, Ismail Walad Sheikh Ahmed, a Mauritanian, and Kenny Gluck, an American. We tried everything to achieve peace, but we came up short. The peace talks were certainly picturesque. They progressed from utter frustration in Geneva in 2015, where the Houthis would not even engage, and the government side showed up with an Al-Qaeda-associated delegate. And the UN Secretary General, Ban Ki-moon, insanely decided to show up to force a photo opportunity with the 2 sides. That had the sole effect of giving the Houthis the opportunity to secure concessions by threatening to scupper his photo opportunity. Back in Switzerland months later, in the mountains, the 2 sides did finally come together, albeit reluctantly and unproductively. Then came Kuwait in the spring and summer of 2016. The real peace talks, which I think may still be the closest we came until 2023. We stayed in a very comfortable hotel for about 3 months. The UN, US, UK, many of the group of ambassadors supporting peace in Yemen, which was then known as the G18, the Group of 18. The Kuwaitis also provided a guest palace for some of the talks. They were gracious, accommodating hosts, but the same really cannot be said of their Houthi guests, who endlessly made unreasonable demands, insisted on a constant supply of gat, an illegal drug, of course, in Kuwait, whose supply or possession is usually a serious criminal offence. The Houthis would arrive late at meetings, they would indulge in tantrums, walkouts, threats and recriminations, and they would change their negotiating position from day to day. The Houthi delegation contained genuine seniors who continue to hold significant positions in the movement to this day. And I'm about to mention Mehdi Mashat, whom Noel mentioned already. So there was a wonderful reflection from a respected veteran Yemeni politician who I'm sure Noel knows very well, or knew very well, Abdul Karim al-Iriani, whose death during my time working on Yemen was generally felt as an end of an era tragedy. He died in late 2015. And speaking of Mehdi Mashat, who was possibly the second most senior and the most obnoxious and destructive member of the Houthi delegation, Iriani is said to have commented that his preferment to a senior role in those days was Iriani's own signal to sign off and die, which he duly did. Mashat had grown up in Sada as a feckless and meritless thug who had just happened to be in Abdul Malik al-Houthi's circle. And it seems that is enough qualification to rise very, very high in the de facto administration in Sana'a. Nevertheless, we kept at it and we edged closer and closer to an agreement. The chief Houthi negotiator and spokesperson was Mohammed Abdul Salam, who retains that role to this day. And he was serious about the Kuwait talks. He earned the confidence of the Saudis, and the outline of an agreement took shape, whereby the Houthis would essentially hold most levers of power in Yemen, and Saudi Arabia would be able to withdraw from the conflict with its dignity intact. And indeed, it sounds very much as if that agreement that we were so close to in Kuwait may be very similar to what is now being talked about since last year. President Hadi, who was president at that time of the legitimate government, he would be marginalized, but his negotiators recognized that the Saudis and others would not support them in opposing this outcome. Now, just when we thought we had a deal, the instructions from Sada changed. Abdul Malik was said to be angry with Abdus Salam's supposed concessions, although those concessions were minimal. The Houthis walked away, and peace talks went on ice for years. Over the following 8 years, battle lines have not moved as much as they did in 2014 to 2016, but Yemen has suffered horrific casualties and damage. Besides Sana'a, contested cities like Hodeidah, Taz, and Marib have been devastated, and obviously Sada, of course, has been devastated too. The UN estimates, as Noel said, that acute food insecurity affects many millions of Yemenis. Now, of course, the focus of the international community has been on peacemaking, just as mine was. And this has limited the appetite for calling the Houthis a terrorist group until their increasing attacks beyond the borders of Yemen caused a shift in opinion. Now, at first, the Houthis really were mainly attempting to hit targets far inside Saudi Arabia with only occasional success. And because they were focused on Saudi Arabia, it was a combatant state, there was still this sort of sense that calling them terrorists might create difficulties in negotiating peace. It might create difficulties in humanitarian delivery. In early 2021, at the time of the transition from Trump to the Biden administration in Washington, D.C., the Houthis were designated by the US as terrorists in January, but then that designation was reversed and lifted in February. But when the Houthis conducted a lethal drone and missile attack on Abu Dhabi in January 2022, the UAE skillfully used its temporary position on the United Nations Security Council to secure Resolution 2624, which branded the Houthis as a terrorist group for the first time by the UN. And this was the state of affairs on October the 6th, 2023. But now, of course, the scenario has changed significantly. We have the Houthis embarking on this reckless program of attacking shipping in the Red Sea and the Bab el-Mandeb, and of course the tolerance of the United States and others for such acts of aggression and international lawlessness was stretched beyond its breaking point. The Suez Canal, the Red Sea shipping route, is vital to the global economy. The risk that significant quantities of shipping have to divert around the southern tip of Africa, as they have, has global implications for trade and inflation. The killing of 10 Houthis and sinking of 3 of their boats by the US Navy in late December was a pretty clear message to the Houthis and to Iran that this campaign of aggression would not be tolerated. But, of course, the Houthis persisted. They drew a UN Security Council resolution condemning their actions, which was interesting because it was not vetoed by either Russia or China, in spite of the, difficult, if you like, the difficult dynamics within the Security Council these days since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, or full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. And at last, following the resolution, we saw the more proactive US and UK strikes on sites, key to the Houthis' capability to launch further attacks. Now, these strikes have not yet succeeded in deterring or preventing further attacks. Of course, besides the Houthis, Iran has publicly arrogated to itself the right to interfere with the safety of international shipping in the Red Sea and to oppose any international efforts to secure it. An Iranian spy ship, the Behshad, is understood to have been guiding some of the Houthi attacks. But such Iranian maritime assets are potentially vulnerable to US or indeed UK action. Now, Noel has talked about the peace talks from last year, and the UN chose a moment in late December to announce the quote, significant step, unquote, that they were taking towards a ceasefire in Yemen. The UN envoy celebrated this progress without making reference to Houthi attacks on international shipping. Now, as Noel has said, of course, there has been a genuine process going on, and there has been genuine progress towards getting to where we were. Essentially, they've got us to roughly where we were in 2016 in Kuwait. My question is whether this Houthi tease of progress towards a ceasefire and peace talks, and having the UN envoy say, oh, we're nearly there, we're almost there, we're going to have a ceasefire, and then the Yemeni peace process will revive. Was that, in fact, part of a Houthi calculated move to play on the international community's long-standing wish for peace in Yemen, and therefore make decisive action against the Houthis and Iran that much more difficult when it could be seen as undermining the prospects for peace? Now, the Saudis have wanted to get out of this war for years. They felt trapped in it. And certainly it became very clear in 2016 that they were looking for an exit, and so clearly they will be concerned about whether the current problem in the Red Sea is going to make it harder for them to exit the conflict. But they also have equities exposed here. Saudi ports on the west coast are exposed to this disruption in the Red Sea, and their ports on the east coast, of course, they're exposed to disruption in the Strait of Hormuz. So it's clear that the Americans cleared their lines with Riyadh before they escalated this campaign to face the Houthis down. And the Americans will also have done the same in Cairo because, of course, although the Houthis claim that they're supporting the Palestinians, the Red Sea campaign has a minimal effect on Israel or Israel's economy. because Israel is perfectly capable, like every other country, of using the Mediterranean Sea and other routes. The only country that is severe, well, the two countries I was going to say which are severely disadvantaged by this is Saudi Arabia, but even more so, of course, Egypt, with Egypt's economy heavily dependent on Suez Canal revenues. So again, this gives the lie to the Houthi claim that they really care about the Palestinians. This is them showing off. It's them flexing their muscles and claiming international attention and international relevance. And the contempt that they have for the well-being of ordinary Egyptians should be no surprise to anyone who's seen the contempt with which they've treated ordinary Yemenis over the years. Now, the question is it possible both to pursue peace in Yemen and deterrence in the Red Sea and the Bab el-Mandeb? And is it also possible to continue humanitarian aid delivery, which is so desperately needed in Yemen? Something indeed that the Houthi campaign in the Red Sea shows again a sort of a lack of interest in humanitarian relief for its own purposes, because of course the port of Hodeidah cannot really function for humanitarian aid deliveries in a world where ships are avoiding the Suez Canal. So recent US actions, including assembling the coalition, including the United Kingdom and others, indicates that this will be the priority. In other words, it has to be the priority. The right of shipping peacefully to transit international navigation routes is established, and it must be reinforced. This is about the international rules-based system. It's about the rule of law. The Houthis are not a recognized government, and attacking them proportionately, of course, is not an act of war against Yemen. Whereas indicating to them that their challenge is too difficult to meet and that they're deigning to talk peace after 9 years of brutalizing the Yemeni population is enough on its own to secure them the latitude to indulge in international blackmail. That would be, in effect, to surrender to them. There is no guarantee that the new UN talks will lead anywhere, because the difficulty of actually managing Yemeni peace talks and creating a stable outcome in Yemen goes way beyond a ceasefire between the Houthis and the Saudis. So the Houthis must be told that those talks are welcomed for their own sake, but they are unrelated to maritime enforcement, just as maritime enforcement is unrelated to the Israeli-Gaza conflict. And they must be told, the Houthis must be told, that they will face severe kinetic consequences if their attacks continue. The one proviso is that kinetic action should not damage critical infrastructure on the Yemeni coast, particularly the port of Hodeidah, which of course is essential to commercial and humanitarian operations. I should also add, during my time as ambassador, there was an endless series of incidents where Iran was accused of arming the Houthis. This was always denied. The Iranians will always deny, but there was rock solid evidence that it was true, and that evidence has just continued to accumulate over the years. There was also reciprocity. During the Houthis' advance across Yemen in 2015, we saw them prioritize releasing prisoners of interest to Iran. There's no doubt of the technical, financial, and logistic support that the Houthis have enjoyed from both Iran and Lebanese Hezbollah. And now we see this clearly in Iran's support for their aggression in the Red Sea. And that brings me to my final point, which is the elephant in the room. At what point do we hold Iran directly accountable for the asymmetric warfare that they have been waging against the West? The matter became acute late last month, not because of any Houthi action, but because of the killing of US troops in Jordan by an Iranian proxy attack. The Biden administration has again raised the stakes, striking a range of Iran-associated targets in Iraq and Syria, besides launching further strikes on the Houthis. But if anti-American attacks persist, and especially if further US personnel are killed, the US is running out of road, before it will be forced to impose direct consequences upon Iran. There are already loud voices in the US calling for this. People are asking why the Bashad has not been sunk. Iran's past conduct suggests that sending an unmistakable but proportionate message does not need to lead to reckless Iranian escalation. Iran is a rational actor. In late December, India deployed ships to warn Iran off any further disruption of Indian Ocean shipping lanes, and Iran backed down. One hesitates to advocate for military action, but it now seems possible that Iran will simply continue to escalate until it's forced to back down by a firmer pushback from the US. It will only recalculate its risk appetite if it now faces severe, targeted penalties for its aggression, coupled with a clear message that there is more to come if necessary. It is profoundly to be hoped that the current US response will prove sufficiently firm pushback to have had that effect already. We will see. Thank you very much, and of course, very happy to address any questions.
Thank you very much indeed. Greg, if you're there.
I am here. Thank you, Charles.
Okay, if you'd like to moderate the talks, then the questions are on the right.
We've had a number of interesting questions come through. The first is, what further economic pressure could be put on Iran, going to your final point, Edmund, to cease supplies of missiles and launchers? Who would not participate in such pressure? Iran, of course, takes hostages. Any thought on the pressure that could be brought to Iran to bear with respect to the Houthi conflict?
Yeah, I mean, very briefly, of course, it's true US Treasury sanctions were very effective on Iran some time ago and led to a more concerted Iranian effort to negotiate with the international community, and that led to the JCPOA. And there are criticisms of the JCPOA, but I think the worst possible outcome was for the JCPOA to be signed and then for the US to withdraw from it. That feels to me as if we really mishandled things as the international community in that respect. The international circumstances for ratcheting up economic pressure are worse than they were because, of course, the level of Russian and Chinese challenge to US economic and currency hegemony is much higher than it was, when in that earlier period that I referred to. Of course, it's true that companies have been reluctant to work with Iran because they recognise that the US was not happy with the JCPOA and they didn't want to find themselves on the wrong end of a hardened US position again. And of course, we don't know what the US position will be next year. My view is that there are some economic levers that can be pulled. Some people are trying to use the existing sanctions and existing controls more actively, using open source intelligence to flag where there are transactions that are already in breach of sanctions, and then bringing those to the attention of the relevant authorities. I think that kind of work is very good and very useful, but I don't think it'll be easy to drive international consensus on massively enhanced commercial countermeasures.
Thank you. We've had a couple of questions come through on US and UK foreign policy, an observation that the key is to stop the war in Gaza and not take on more third parties and growing Middle East opposition to US and UK policy. Also a question of what's the foreign policy objective served for the UK in taking military action? Now, I think you've broadly answered those by stating that the foreign policy objective is to ensure the global shipping remains open and available and operative in order for international trade to continue. My question off the back of that is, if that is a foreign policy objective, surely that objective goes far wider than simply the US and the UK and the European entities, the European jurisdictions that are dealing with that. And that foreign policy objective goes to the entire world. Egypt being an example, why is Egypt not participating? Why are the Saudis not participating? Why is China not participating in ensuring global trade is protected?
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely true. The reason Egypt and Saudi Arabia are cautious, of course, is because the Houthi narrative, although it's an entirely false narrative, it has achieved some resonance in the Islamic world, and so Egypt and Saudi Arabia don't want to be cheerleaders for enforcement against the Houthis because they don't want that to be interpreted as them being cheerleaders against a ceasefire in Gaza. So that's a fact that's operating. I do want to challenge the idea that the US and the UK are just making themselves more and more unpopular in the Arab world. We've been through many iterations of anger in the Arab street. It's often misinterpreted and it often passes as well. I can even remember that there were concerns about anger on the Arab street about the liberation of Kuwait from Saddam Hussein. And frankly, if we'd been forced not to take the correct action in Kuwait at that time, it would have been a preemptive cringe that would have caused us problems in the future. And I think we're in that situation now. The international shipping and international law are non-negotiable. This is nothing to do with Gaza. And this has to be enforced as a separate issue. The dynamics in Gaza and Israel can be debated by others. Of course, we want to see that crisis resolved. We want to see peace restored between Israel and the Palestinians. We want to see a meaningful peace process in Israel and Palestine. But the Houthis don't care about that. The Houthis, even going back to their slogan, which Noel quoted, is not about peace with Israel. It's about the destruction of Israel.
You mentioned the Arab street. Let's look for a moment at the streets in the US and in Europe, and that's both physically in the streets and also online. There's been what I would say a substantial and worrying level of pro-Houthi support, popular support shown in the West. Is that because they don't fully understand how barbaric and horrific the Houthis are and what they're doing to their own population? Is that related to the misplaced support for what's happening in Israel and Gaza? What explains that, and what effect would that have, the increased Houthi support that we're seeing?
I think it's down to all the things you say. I think you accurately diagnose it. Some of the people protesting have been interviewed and completely unable to find any of the relevant places on a map. I mean, the West is full of useful idiots, I'm afraid. Those protests, I mean, they are, people have the right to protest, and it's certainly true that concern about Palestinian civilian casualties is a legitimate concern, but it's also true that Hamas is not even beginning to hint that it intends anything other than to continue its campaign to destroy Israel. Hamas seeks a ceasefire. What it means by a ceasefire is the opportunity to regroup in order to carry out the October 7th attacks again. And so I think it's really important that responsible governments in the West accurately diagnose this. And I have to say that I think that the Biden administration, which is, of course, from the left side of the US spectrum, and the Sunak administration in the UK, which is from the right side of the spectrum politically, I think they've called this exactly right.
An interesting question. What is the significance of the appointment yesterday by the PLC of the new Prime Minister, Ahmed Awad bin Mubarak, who was previously the Yemeni ambassador to the US? And that news only came out yesterday. Any significance there?
I'll pass to Noel in a second on this, but I mean, only to say I know Ahmed very, very well. We were friends during the peace negotiations. And then, of course, I had some contact with him when he was in the US and I was in the UN. He's a good guy. He's got bitter personal experience of having been arrested, detained and brutalized by the Houthis. I'm not sure that I can see exactly what that does to change anything, except perhaps strengthening the relationship between the governing council and the United States.
Noel, you're on mute.
Yeah, I mean, there's been this appointment of a new prime minister for the PLC has been expected for some time. There's quite a lot of wrangling between the groups over what it should do, and they've had problems in agreeing the makeup of it. But as Ed says, he's a good guy. I bet you too, and. He told me his punishment, but when he was held by the Houthi, was being made to read the Malazim of Badruddin al-Houthi. I don't think he was terribly impressed, but he's a good guy. He's effective, and he was also head of Hadi's office, a key figure in the national dialogue at the time. So he's experienced, been around for a long time, and I think he's a good candidate to be prime minister.
We have an interesting question. I'm aware of time, Charles. We have an interesting question on any thoughts regarding regime change across the region, for example, in Iran, in Egypt, as a consequence of whether a regional war or worse might unfold?
Well, I think we must earnestly hope that there won't be a regional war, and that a lot there depends upon the proportionality of US action. I think it's already clear that the Iranian response to the crisis between Israel and the Palestinians has been quite carefully calibrated. And, had there been a sort of an Iranian desire to go all in, then we would have seen a massive escalation in Lebanese Hezbollah attacks into northern Israel, whereas instead there's been a sort of a steady drumbeat of attack, which has been intended to send the message that, yes, we support Palestinians, but the Palestinians, I shouldn't say the Palestinians, Hamas have read the level of Lebanese Hezbollah activity as a little bit of a slap in the face. You really don't care about us that much, do you? Because you're kind of keeping your powder dry. So that's an interesting thing, and I think the Biden administration is trying to read those signals. It's very difficult to read accurately, and as I said, they're subject to a lot of criticism from the Republican side about not being muscular enough. And I think history will, events as they play out will tell us whether that's real or not. In terms of regime change, one of the arguments has always been that a change in Iran will only come when the reform movements in Iran get strong enough, and gradually these periodic crises will eventually overwhelm what is a very unpopular, sclerotic, clerical regime in Tehran. Whereas if you have a war, that strengthens the regime. People have often, spoken in those terms. I think, clearly a war would be very disruptive, extremely disruptive and dangerous. And it doesn't help that you have now something approaching an alliance between Iran and Russia. So we have to hope that that there is a lot of active deconfliction messaging that is going on, and that red lines are clearly understood in such a way that this crisis can be addressed and then gradually dampened down.
And in that sense, you mentioned the increased clamor for muscularity from the Republicans in the US. Is a more muscular approach the solution to this, or is it more subtle than that?
Well, I think it's an open debate, isn't it? I mean, that question of whether there is, I tried to say towards the end of my presentation, it may be that the current round of activity that we're seeing from the Americans that has extended to Iraq and Syria, and according to President Biden, is not over yet. This is an ongoing campaign, and we will respond at the time and in the manner of our choosing. If this is enough that we don't see further escalation from the Iranians, and then it's possible to turn one's attention back to trying to make peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians, then perhaps Biden has got this right. But it's extremely difficult calculation. It's very easy if you are John Bolton to say, we need to start hammering targets inside Iran. I'm not saying he's wrong, but it's a very high risk strategy, and of course he's not the one taking the risk.
And the Americans have taken that risk previously, though. I'm thinking, for example, the assassination of Qasem Soleimani number of years ago, the response from Iran was extremely carefully calibrated not to overspill at any point, and the Americans showed muscle at that point.
Yes, I don't disagree with you, and nor do I disagree with the idea that something like that may be necessary now. But I understand that why the Biden administration is going through the stages of progressive muscularity in the way that it is.
We have many more questions, but I am conscious that we're running out of time. And Charles, I'd like to pass back to you. Thank you.